Somewhere on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1941, a dog wearing a canvas pack loaded with roughly 12 pounds of high explosives sprinted toward a German Panzer IV. The animal had been trained for months. It had been starved for days, and it had no idea what was about to happen to it. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had deployed an estimated 40,000 of these animals. This is the story of what that actually looked like, and why it was far more catastrophic than anyone in Moscow ever admitted. The year is 1941, and the Soviet Union is in a state of total collapse. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22nd of that year, sent roughly 3.8 million Axis troops crashing across the Soviet border simultaneously along a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It was the largest land invasion in recorded human history, and it was working with a speed that stunned even the German commanders executing it. Within the first 72 hours, the Red Army had lost over 4,000 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground before pilots even reached their cockpits. Tank losses in the first weeks of fighting reached into the thousands. Entire Soviet armies, some numbering over 600,000 men, were encircled and systematically destroyed in a matter of days at places like Kiev and Vyazma. The Red Army in 1941 was not just losing, it was being erased from the map in real time. Stalin's military had entered the war in a state that still defies easy description. The officer purges of 1937 and 1938 had executed or imprisoned somewhere between 34,000 and 40,000 Red Army officers, gutting the institutional knowledge of an entire armed force in less than 2 years. 3 of the Red Army's 5 marshals had been shot. 13 of its 15 Army commanders were dead or imprisoned. 50 of its 57 corps commanders had been removed. The men who replaced them were often promoted not because of ability, but because everyone more qualified was already dead. Commanders who survived the purges often did so by saying yes to everything and questioning nothing. Innovation was dangerous. Independent thought could earn you a bullet in the back of the head in the basement of Lubyanka prison. What replaced genuine military thinking was a desperate improvisation, a willingness to use anything, send anyone, and sacrifice everything in the hope that sheer mass could substitute for competence. And that right there tells you everything about why the anti-tank dog program existed at all. It was not a weapon born of sophisticated military science. It was a weapon born of desperation. The kind of desperation that comes when you are losing a war so badly and so fast that you start strapping explosives to animals and calling it strategy. The Soviet anti-tank dog program did not begin in 1941. It began in 1924, which means it had been in development for 17 years before the first German tank crossed the Soviet border. The program was officially managed through a military unit called the Central School of Military Dog Handling, based in Kratovo, outside Moscow. By the mid-1930s, it had grown into a serious institutional effort, with dedicated kennels, trained instructors, and a formal doctrine manual. By 1941, the program had processed thousands of dogs and hundreds of handlers, and Soviet military command formally classified it as a viable frontline anti-tank capability. What they had created, technically, was a system called the PT Mine, an abbreviation of the Russian Protivo-tankovaya mina, carried by dogs designated as mine dogs, or in Russian, Sobaki Mineri. The breed selection was deliberate. German Shepherds, Airedales, and mixed large breeds were preferred. Animals big enough to carry the payload, fast enough to cross open ground, and calm enough to work around machinery without breaking and training. Smaller dogs were rejected. Aggressive dogs that bit their handlers were culled. And what the program wanted was a dog that was obedient, fast, and deeply food motivated. That last quality was not incidental. It was the entire mechanical basis of how the weapon was supposed to work. The mechanics of the system were straightforward in theory. A dog was fitted with a vest-like canvas harness carrying approximately 10 to 12 pounds of TNT with a wooden detonating lever, roughly 20 centimeters long, protruding rigidly upward from the top of the pack. When the idea was this: the dog would run beneath a tank, the lever would catch on the vehicle's undercarriage, the pin would be pulled, and the charge would detonate directly against the vehicle's most vulnerable surface, its belly armor. Early German tanks of 1941 carried only 10 to 15 millimeters of belly plating, far thinner than their frontal or side armor. A properly positioned 12-pound TNT charge detonating at contact range against that surface could penetrate the hull, ignite the fuel tanks, and kill the crew in an instantaneous fireball. The math on paper was sound. A 12-pound charge was more than sufficient to defeat the armor thickness involved. The German Panzer III, the most common tank in the 1941 invasion force, had belly armor of just 10 millimeters. The Panzer IV was comparable. If the dog reached the target and held position beneath the hull, the resulting detonation would be lethal to everything inside. One of the central figures in the program's operational deployment during 1941 was Lieutenant Colonel Grigory Medvedev, then in his early 40s, stationed with the 161st Anti-Tank Dog Battalion near the Bryansk front. Medvedev had been one of the program's early institutional advocates and had worked with the dogs personally since the mid-1930s, participating in training exercises and annual evaluations. He was, by the accounts that survive in Soviet military administrative records, a methodical and experienced officer who genuinely believed the weapon could perform as designed under the right field conditions. The conditions he was about to be handed were not the right ones, and there is no evidence that anyone in his chain of command gave him any warning of what was coming. The training method for mine dogs is the detail that requires you to stop and sit with for a moment, because it reveals something critical about how this weapon was designed and how it was always going to fail. Dogs were not trained to run toward the sound of German tank engines. They were not trained to target vehicles through visual recognition or heat signatures. They were trained through hunger. Trainers withheld food for 24 to 48 hours, then placed the dog's meal bowl beneath a stationary Soviet tank with the engine running. The dog learned, through daily repetition over several weeks, that food existed under tanks. The sound of a diesel engine running, the smell of exhaust and machine oil, the vibration of metal treads at idle. These became, in the dog's conditioned neurological response, signals that a meal was available beneath a large piece of machinery. The training was consistent, the conditioning was effective, and the dogs performed well in controlled exercises. And the problem was visible to anyone who asked the obvious question. And this is important, because the implications of that training method are devastating once you follow them to their logical end. The dogs had been conditioned specifically on Soviet tanks, Soviet engine sounds, Soviet diesel fuel, the particular acoustic and olfactory signature of Red Army armored vehicles. When they were released on a battlefield where German vehicles were burning a different fuel blend and running different engines with different acoustic profiles, and where Soviet tanks were positioned directly behind the handler lines, the dogs had no reliable mechanism to distinguish friend from foe. They had been trained to run toward a very specific and narrow set of sensory triggers. There was no guarantee, and in fact very little probability, that those precise triggers would be the dominant signals on a chaotic frontline battlefield. But here's the thing. This was not a flaw discovered in combat. Soviet trainers and program evaluators had identified this exact vulnerability before the war began and had submitted written concerns through official channels as early as 1938. The concerns were reviewed, noted, and set aside. The program continued. Funding continued. Doctrine manuals continued to describe the mine dog as a deployable weapon. And when the German invasion came and tank units were burning and rifle divisions were being annihilated and the entire Western Soviet Union was falling apart, no one in the chain of command was going to pause the anti-tank dog program to conduct a safety review. You used what you had. You used everything you had. And if the weapon had problems, those problems would become someone else's problem later. The exposed vulnerability at the core of the entire program was not the dogs and it was not the handlers. It was the fundamental gap between the controlled conditions in which the weapon had been designed and tested and the living, burning, noise-saturated reality of an actual Eastern Front engagement. In training at Kratovo, the environment was controlled. One tank, one dog, one food reward, repeatable conditions. But the Soviet dog handler unit, moving toward a German armored position in the summer of 1941, was entering a landscape of overlapping noise sources, artillery detonations, small arms fire, aircraft engines, screaming men, burning vehicles, The simultaneous running of dozens of different engines from both sides of the line. The dog was not a remote-controlled device executing a targeting algorithm. It was a conditioned animal responding to sensory input it had been trained on under completely different circumstances. And it was being released into a situation where the sensory input most familiar to it, Soviet tank exhaust, Soviet engine vibration, was coming from directly behind it. On the morning of July 13th, 1941, near the town of Mogilev in what is now Belarus, when one of the most extensively documented early deployments of anti-tank dog units occurred during the broader German drive towards Smolensk. German Army Group Center was pressing forward with elements of the 2nd Panzer Group under General Heinz Guderian, whose armored columns had been advancing at a rate that Soviet commanders described in their own reports as catastrophic, sometimes covering 50 kilometers in a single day across terrain that conventional military doctrine would have predicted would slow armor considerably. Soviet commanders in the Mogilev sector had received orders to delay the German advance by any means at their disposal. The phrase used in operational records was bukvalno, semi sredstvami, literally by every possible means. Among the units ordered forward were elements of the 161st Anti-Tank Dog Battalion under Medvedev's command. The handlers moved their animals into forward positions under cover of pre-dawn darkness, before full daylight had broken over the flat Belarusian countryside. Each dog was fitted with its vest, the explosive charge secured, the detonating lever locked upright. The animals were held on short leads, muzzled during movement to prevent noise, the muzzles removed only when the unit reached its release position. The German column approaching from the west consisted of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks leading, half-tracks carrying motorized infantry behind them, with motorcycle reconnaissance elements running ahead of the main body. The Soviet plan was to release the dogs in coordinated waves of 3 to 5 animals each, targeting the lead tanks in the column, and then exploit the resulting disruption and any disabled vehicles as cover for a Soviet infantry counterattack from prepared positions to the north. The sequence had a clear operational logic. What happened next did not follow any of it. The first wave of dogs was released at approximately 0640 hours as the German column came within range. The lead German vehicle was roughly 280 to 300 meters from the release point. The dogs ran. And here's where it gets interesting. They ran, but not toward the German vehicles. At least 3 of the 5 animals in the first wave turned within the first 50 meters, broke back toward the Soviet lines, and accelerated toward the sound and smell they had been trained on for months. The Soviet armored vehicles positioned behind the handler lines. The handlers were standing within 30 to 40 meters of their own tanks, which were running at idle, producing exactly the sensory environment the dogs associated with food. The dogs were doing precisely what they had been conditioned to do. They were following their training perfectly. The training had just been designed for the wrong battlefield. 2 of those returning animals were shot by their own handlers before they reached the Soviet vehicles. The shots were not clean. One dog detonated on impact with rifle fire at close range, close enough that the handler who fired the shot was thrown from his feet by the blast and sustained injuries that removed him from action. The third dog was not intercepted. It ran the full distance back to the Soviet armored line, went beneath a T-26 light tank that was sitting at idle with its crew inside, and the lever caught. The detonation killed the 2-man crew of the T-26 instantly and blew the tank's fuel tank, which then burned for over 20 minutes. It was the first confirmed friendly fire fatality involving a mine dog on the Eastern Front, and it happened within 4 minutes of the first animal being released. What the German tankers were observing from inside their vehicles at that same moment was a scene that took trained soldiers several seconds to process. A Panzer III tank commander in the lead vehicle of the column, peering through his vision port at the Soviet lines ahead, was watching Soviet soldiers running toward their own tanks and appeared to be shooting at animals on the ground. The German column had not yet been engaged by any weapon that was threatening to the vehicles. The lead commander's initial assessment, recorded in a post-engagement report later compiled by 2nd Panzer Group staff, was that he believed he was witnessing some kind of breakdown of unit discipline among the Soviet defenders, possibly panic-induced by the column's approach, possibly a fratricide event caused by poor Soviet fire discipline. He did not immediately recognize the Mind Dog apparatus because the weapon was not yet documented in German intelligence files. It was only after the engagement ended and German infantry recovered the carcasses of the dogs shot in the open ground that the harness and detonator system was identified, photographed, and reported up the chain of command. The German tactical adaptation was systematic, fast, and lethal. Within 48 hours of the Mogilev engagement, and two similar incidents reported the same week near Vitebsk and Orsha, Guderian's headquarters had compiled the available information and distributed an operational bulletin to every forward unit in the 2nd Panzer Group. The bulletin described the Mind Dog weapon in detail: its appearance when fitted with the harness, the visible detonating lever, the likely behavior of the animal in a combat environment, and the required countermeasure. The countermeasure was not complicated. Every infantryman in a forward position was to treat any dog approaching from the direction of Soviet lines as a live explosive device to be engaged and destroyed at maximum range. Machine gun crews received specific instruction to prioritize mine dogs before they closed within 50 meters of any armored vehicle. Snipers at forward posts were tasked with engaging dogs at extended range whenever Soviet positions were known to contain dog handler units. The effect of this adaptation was devastating and nearly instantaneous. A dog running across 280 meters of open ground toward a prepared German defensive line was not going to reach its target. German MG-34 machine guns, firing at a cyclic rate of approximately 800 to 900 rounds per minute, with effective range against a moving ground target well beyond 200 meters, could track and neutralize a running dog in the open with a short burst. The weapon had been designed to exploit the element of surprise, a fast animal crossing ground quickly, difficult to spot, reaching a tank before the crew could react. That window of surprise had closed permanently within the first week of the weapon's operational deployment. Every German unit that received the bulletin knew what to look for, knew how to respond, and had orders that made engaging the dogs a tactical priority. Let me give you the numbers, because the scale of the failure is important to understand clearly. In the period between June 1941 and late 1943, Soviet records, which were incomplete, inconsistently maintained, and in some cases deliberately understated, document anti-tank dog deployments in at least 13 separate engagements on the Eastern Front. Across those 13 documented events, somewhere between 300 and 400 animals were deployed in the Mind Dog role. Of that total, fewer than 20 are credited in any surviving record, Soviet or German, with successfully reaching and detonating against an actual German armored vehicle. That is a success rate of somewhere between 4 and 6% against the intended target. But the animals that did not reach German vehicles did not simply fail neutrally. They detonated somewhere. Soviet records acknowledge at least 14 separate friendly fire detonation events involving returning dogs, and on German operational reports from multiple sectors describe additional detonations in Soviet forward trenches, in open ground among Soviet infantry, and on at least 3 occasions against Soviet vehicles other than the T-26 lost at Mogilev. The total Soviet casualties attributable to Mind Dog friendly fire events, soldiers killed or seriously wounded by their own weapon, is documented at between 25 and 40 men in the sources that survive. None, though military historians who have examined the full record believe the actual number was meaningfully higher given the systematic underreporting of self-inflicted losses in Red Army records from 1941. And that right there tells you everything. The program destroyed more Soviet assets than German ones across the documented engagements. It had been flagged as structurally flawed before a single wartime deployment took place. It continued to be resourced and deployed for over 2 years after those flaws became catastrophically visible. The 40,000 dogs trained across the full course of the war served in many roles: scouting, casualty retrieval, cable laying, and supply carrying. And some of those applications were genuinely effective and saved Soviet lives. But the Mind Dog specifically, the anti-tank Mind Dog that the program was built around and most publicly associated with, here failed by every relevant metric and kept failing while the institution responsible for it declined to admit it. The program's slow fade from the front line followed the pattern that institutional failures in heavily centralized command systems tend to follow. Not a decisive moment of accountability, but a quiet withdrawal of resources. There was never an order from Moscow officially terminating the anti-tank dog program. No commissar issued a directive acknowledging that the weapon did not work. When the mine dog units simply stopped receiving resupply priority for explosive charges. Handlers were gradually reassigned to the scouting and casualty roles. By the spring of 1943, the program existed on paper, but had essentially ceased to function as an anti-armor capability. The improved conventional alternatives that replaced it, the PTRS-41 and PTR-D-41 anti-tank rifles, better sighted artillery, and eventually the T-34 tank produced in quantities that made German armored superiority increasingly untenable, did the work the mine dogs were supposed to do. Grigory Medvedev survived the war. He was wounded at least twice, once in the brutal winter fighting of late 1941 along the Bryansk front, and again during the Kursk offensive in the summer of 1943. The largest tank battle in history, a battle in which there were no mine dogs. A post-war Soviet records show he was awarded 2 military decorations for his service across the war's duration. His personal file does not record any formal acknowledgement of the Mogilev deployment or the events of July 13, 1941. Given the political climate of the Soviet Union through the late 1940s and 1950s, it is unlikely he would have raised the subject voluntarily, and even less likely that anyone would have asked him about it in a way that produced a written record. Programs that failed were absorbed into the larger silence surrounding all the ways the Soviet Union had failed in 1941 and the years that followed. The handlers who stood in those forward positions, young men, most of them in their late teens or early 20s, some of whom had trained with specific dogs for months and formed the kind of attachment that develops between a person and an animal they work with daily, left almost nothing in the documentary record. The ones who survived the war returned to a country that had lost an estimated 27 million people and had neither the institutional bandwidth nor the political permission to examine in detail what had gone wrong with a program that strapped bombs to dogs. The battlefield near Mogilev, examined by Soviet forces in the weeks that followed the German advance, showed the wreckage that the Eastern Front left everywhere it passed. Shell craters, burned vehicles, abandoned equipment, what dead men in the positions where they fell, and between the lines in the flat ground between the Soviet release points and the German column's path, the evidence of the weapon that had failed before it crossed halfway to its target. There is something the anti-tank dog program tells you that no amount of statistics fully captures. It tells you that desperation does not produce clarity. It tells you that when a system has destroyed its own capacity for honest evaluation, through purges, through fear, through the political impossibility of saying that something does not work, that system will keep deploying broken weapons until the broken weapons stop being available. The men who ran the program were not incompetent. The men who flagged its flaws were not ignored because they were wrong. They were ignored because the system had no mechanism for acting on the information they provided. The weapon continued because stopping it required an admission. And admissions in that context carried consequences no one was willing to accept. The dogs did not know any of that. They had been trained to run towards something specific. They followed their training exactly. And in a war that killed 27 million Soviet citizens, the weapon that was supposed to save them burned their own soldiers alive instead.